This is Dr. Linda Snetselaar, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and I'm honored to have with me today Dr. Sue Krebs-Smith, who is the former chief of the Risk Factor Assessment Branch. She is now retired, but she spent several years there in the National Cancer Institute at the National Institutes of Health. And today, the topic that we're focusing on is the Healthy Eating Index 2015, and we will be talking about ways in which this particular index can be used by registered dietitians. I think it's important for all of you tuning in today to know that the September issue of the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics will have 3 articles, each of which will be focusing on a different aspect of the Healthy Eating Index 2015. So, Dr. Krebs-Smith, thank you so much for being with us today, and I will begin with my first question, and that relates to the development of the Healthy Eating Index. I know that you were a part of its development from the beginning, and I'm just wondering what the original reason was for developing this particular index.
Well, thank you for inviting me today, Dr. Snetselaar. It's a pleasure to be here and to let dietitians know a little more about the Healthy Eating Index. The HEI was originally developed in the mid-1990s as a tool to evaluate the extent to which Americans are following federal dietary recommendations. So it was originally designed and developed by USDA, actually, to measure the diets of individuals. But as time went on and we had a greater realization that this food consumption that individuals take part in occurs within the context of a broader food system, by the time the 2005 dietary guidelines came out, it seemed that it would be important to have an index that could measure the healthfulness of food all along the food supply chain, as well as the consumption of individuals. And so the National Cancer Institute teamed up with USDA to completely revise the index in correspondence with the 2005 dietary guidelines in order to evaluate the environment as well. And this feature, the HEI's applicability to any set of foods in the food supply chain, is really key to its usefulness.
Yes, and I know I have used it and continue to use it in several studies. So its development has definitely been of benefit to the work that I have done over the years. I was also wondering, I know that we receive a lot of articles in our journal that include the HEI, and I'm wondering, are there possibly ways that might be inappropriate in terms of use of the HEI?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I guess I would say there are several ways the score could be misinterpreted, and to avoid them, practitioners should be mindful of several things. First, I guess I would say to use a single version of the score when making comparisons or tracking trends. Since 2005, the score has been updated a couple of times. There's a 2005 HEI, 2010, and 2015. And each version is designed to measure concordance with that particular set of dietary guidelines. And although the scales match up pretty well, they're not directly comparable. So using a single version when making comparisons is important. The other thing that relates to misinterpretation, I think I would say, is that when practitioners are using the score to describe diets or any part of the food stream, that the suitability of the energy level should be considered before giving any advice based on low moderation component scores. The reason for this is the score is density-based, and that means it evaluates the appropriateness of each dietary component relative to the energy value of a given set of foods. And if someone has a low score on the total fruit component, for example, it might mean they should have more fruit, or it might mean they're getting too many calories from added sugars or saturated fats or refined grains. And as many dietitians know, for most people in this country, additional servings of, say, fruits, vegetables, and whole grains are best thought of as substitutions for foods contributing excess energy and few nutrients. So I think dietitians sort of intuitively understand that second point. And the final thing I guess I would say about misinterpretation, with this update, most recent update, we have acknowledged that some practitioners will want a way to understand the numerical scores better. And we liken this to a grading system. However, with simplicity comes a loss of information. So the scores should never be converted to categories or, grades, if you will, for use in analysis, only in helping people to understand or be able to interpret what, say, an 87 is compared to a 65.
Okay, great. Very important as we're using HEI. I know that sometimes the scoring may seem deceptively simple to calculate, and I know that the scores are used in many different types of analyses, and I was just wondering how might the scoring get very complicated depending on the type of analysis you're using?
Oh, that's another good question. That the scores can get complicated to calculate, even though laid out in the paper with the scoring standards and just a dozen or so components, and you add up the scores, it seems straightforward enough. But because the scores involve ratios, it can get complicated quickly. And this is especially true with analyses involving individual diets. And that's why we included a key third paper in the series with this revision of the HEI. And that third paper is on how to apply the score, especially for the purposes of examining individual diets or groups of individuals' diets. As I mentioned, the issues arise because of the nature of dietary intake data and the density feature of the score, or that use of ratios in the calculation of the score. Researchers do need to follow guidance on how to use the score, and the paper lays that out very well. And there's also further information and programs available online. So researchers could Google HEI with NCI, just Google those two terms, and they would be able to find some further guidance even beyond what's laid out in the paper. But in addition to being careful about how they're doing their research, they also have to be clear about what they've done, because there are different ways the scores could be calculated. If somebody's going to try to do some comparative analysis or replicate their work, they have to be clear about how they have calculated the scores.
Yes, thank you. All very important points. And I want to just sort of underscore that third paper. Sharon Kirkpatrick led the particular design of that paper with many people serving as co-authors, but I think that whole concept of application is incredibly important, and so I'm hoping that all three articles in the journal will be of help to anyone coming to read it and then using it as they're doing research, because just as you said, things may seem very simple on the surface, but can get complicated rather quickly. So thank you.
Right. Yeah. I hope it makes those three papers make a useful package of kind of what researchers and practitioners need to know to employ the index. Yeah.
Most definitely. What are some of your ideas on the usefulness of the index relative to sort of looking at research versus counseling? And a lot of the readers of our journal will be doing counseling, so I think that question sort of speaks to the idea of how do we use that index in kind of real-world situations?
Right, right. Well, an index, you know, sometimes we can think of an index as, you know, it's a leading indicator of how something's doing. We've got the, you know, the stock indices that are reported on the news every day, and I think the HEI could be, you know, if we're tracking that for the nation or any, you know, large area, region, or set of foods or something, we're tracking that over time. We can keep, you know, having a good metric for how something is doing in the more sort of global sense. But so we've always kind of thought of it as a descriptive tool, and then and we've written over the years with the 2005 and the 2010 edition, and even further now with the 2015, about how it can be applied in research. So in addition to just using it for monitoring and applying it in research, we're starting to think about how it might be used for counseling. Now, it wasn't originally developed with that in mind, and we've mentioned its complexity, so maybe it's not going to prove to be the easiest thing to use for counseling, and that might not be the best use of it. But we are very interested in trying to explore whether that could be, whether that's, you know, whether the concept of it is understandable enough, or do people need to know how the score is calculated in order to know if, you know, is it sufficient to know they've got a grade of D on how it is that they're eating, and we could just tell them how it is that they could be improving their diet, or are they going to get caught up in the math of the score, and would that be prove it to not be so useful? So those are some of the questions that we're grappling with now, and we're really just now considering ways that it can be used for counseling. So I think, though, the score will need to be tested for how well patients and other consumers understand it, and for what types of feedback are most interpretable and actionable for them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, excellent. I think just the fact that you're looking into that aspect of its use, I think, is really superb. I was also wondering, and this sort of speaks to the future of the HEI, what is needed, do you feel, for the HEI to reach what we might think of as its full potential?
Yes, that gets at the fact that it's not really yet at its full potential. I think there's much more that can be used, many more ways that we can employ it, and it could help to shape the American diet more surely if we could address some of these. So one thing is that calculating the scores requires, for each food, the amount of each dietary component that's represented in the score, as well as knowing the energy value. And we have databases to assess the amounts of each of these dietary components, the amounts of fruits and vegetables, added sugar, and so on. When we're doing scores for at the individual level, individual food consumption, like might be reported in national food consumption surveys, and we have the requisite databases to apply the score when we're looking at the whole aggregate U.S. food supply, tons of flour and meat and vegetables and so on that are consumed. But if someone wanted to assess, for example, the HEI of food flowing through a particular grocery chain, for example, they'd not only need to access the information on the throughput, you know, get the grocery store to give them information about what is coming through and how much of each food, but they'd need a composition database to link to those data that would have information about the amounts of fruits, vegetables, and so on. Now we have a lot of label information with nutrients, and now we'll have added sugars, and we have saturated fat, we have energy. So some of those, and sodium, some of the things that are in the score are on food labels, but the cup equivalents of fruits and vegetables, and the amount of whole grains in terms of ounce equivalents is not going to be on the label. And so we need to build those composition databases in order to be able to do that. But I really do think that that if we could build that infrastructure, we could really learn an awful lot about the food as it comes through the food supply chain from the aggregate U.S. food supply to individuals' plates. And there has been an effort with something called the Branded Foods Database that USDA has compiled in concert with private partners. And they're certainly looking into and hope to someday be able to facilitate having HEI analyses as conducted with that database if they can add the requisite fields of information for that. So I guess database infrastructure is the main thing for it to reach its full potential. But there is another thing. There's a lot of interest more recently in looking at HEI scores of individuals and groups of individuals, not just for monitoring and surveillance, but to look at it in an epidemiologic context, to look at the relationship between diets and health outcome, for example. And we need some additional research on whether and how to account for measurement error in epi-analyses of dietary patterns. Just how critical measurement error is in such a context, and what we need to do about it. Those are questions that are outstanding, and that remains to be determined. So there's database development and some epi research that needs to happen.
Well, great ideas, and certainly important things to look forward to, I think, in terms of the future relative to HEI. Thank you so much for being a part of the podcast today, and I feel as though many of the things that you talked about are incredibly important to the direction we go in terms of using the HEI, the fact that it can be very versatile, and as you're working with it, working on it, you are looking at many different directions, many different ways to go, which I think is very exciting. So thank you so very much for your expertise today. We look forward to the September issue with all of the articles being set up so that dietitians, I think, can learn a great deal about HEI, and I thank you so much for your role in each of those articles that will be appearing in our journal in the September issue. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Snetselaar, for the opportunity to share the work of this this terrific team that I had the opportunity to work with at NCI and our colleagues outside of the Institute on these papers. And we're really grateful for the opportunity to share this with dietitians. So thank you so much.
Thank you.